Good evening, my little creatures of the night. Mr. Wendigo back again with your late night creature feature. Before we begin, I'm curious. Where are you listening from tonight? Alone in your room? Driving through empty roads? Drop a comment and let me know. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now then, let's see what tonight's tale brings us. The lights over Bayou Blue. Bayou Blue, Louisiana doesn't feel like land so much as something that hasn't finished deciding whether it wants to be water yet. The ground shifts when you walk on it. The trees grow sideways before they remember to grow up, and the air sits so thick and warm that breathing feels like drinking something you didn't ask for. The crawfish pond stretched low and wide across the Fletcher property, cut by thin levees that sank a little more every season. Cypress knees broke the surface like arthritic knuckles, and Spanish moss hung from the branches like the swamp was slowly trying to bandage itself. The whole place smelled like rot and iron and bait fish that had been sitting in the sun about 2 days too long. You got used to it. Or you left. Most people left. Amos Fletcher stood knee-deep in the black water, his boots suctioned into mud that didn't want to let go. He was 63 years old, built like a man who'd spent those years fighting the land for everything it gave him. His hands were raw and split from working the traps, the skin cracked in deep lines that never quite healed between seasons. Every cut burned when the water seeped in. The kind of burn you stop noticing after the first hour because your body just accepts it as the cost of doing business. He rolled the last trap of the morning toward the sorting table, the muscles in his lower back screaming at him the whole way. The wire cage was heavy with crawfish, good ones, too, the size that restaurants paid premium for. He dumped them onto the metal table and watched them scatter and climb over each other, claws snapping at nothing, stupid with panic. 3 pounds easy, maybe 3.5. At current market rates, that was almost enough to feel hopeful about. This haul mattered. One good season meant keeping the land another year, meant paying off the equipment loans and the back taxes and having enough left over to fix the pump house roof that had been leaking since March. One bad season meant selling to the developers who'd been circling the property like patient buzzards ever since his daddy died. They wanted to drain the ponds and pave the swamp flat and build another subdivision full of houses that would flood every time a heavy rain blew through from the Gulf. Amos had told them no 6 times already. He'd planned to keep telling them no until they put him in the ground next to his father and his grandfather and the 3 generations of Fletchers who'd worked this water before him. They worked the ponds until the sun sat low and orange over the tree line, and by then Amos's back had graduated from aching to actively filing complaints. Juniper had gone inside an hour ago to start supper, leaving him to haul the last of the traps alone. He didn't mind. Quiet was good. Quiet meant the crawfish were fat and the equipment wasn't breaking and nobody was driving up the dirt road to make him another offer he'd have to refuse. The Reed brothers finished up behind the equipment shed, hosing mud off the flat bottom and arguing about something pointless the way they always did. Ryder and Beau had been working the Fletcher property for 3 seasons now, living in that dented airstream they'd towed in from somewhere outside Houston. Ryder was the older one, 29, loud, built like he'd been assembled from spare parts that didn't quite match. Had a laugh like a screen door in a windstorm and a talent for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time. Beau was quieter, watched more than he talked. 26 years old with the kind of face that made you think he was always doing math in his head, calculating odds on something he wasn't sharing. "I'm just saying," Ryder called out, loud enough to carry across the whole yard. "The second this season wraps, I'm gone, somewhere dry. Somewhere with actual roads and buildings and women who ain't related to half the zip code." "You said that last year." Beau kept coiling rope, not looking up. "Last year I meant it less. You also said you were gonna quit drinking." "I quit drinking whiskey. Beer don't count. Beer's basically bread." "That's not how any of that works." "I'm carb loading. For the drive out of here. Ryder grinned and kicked mud off his boots. Maybe I'll go to Nevada, get a job at one of them big casinos, wear a vest, deal cards to rich idiots. You don't know how to play cards. I know how to look like I do. That's half of everything. Beau didn't answer. He'd stopped coiling the rope and was staring out at the tree line where the cypress grew thick enough to turn afternoon into permanent dusk. The Spanish moss hung dead still. No breeze moving through it, no bugs clicking in the brush, no frogs hollering from the shallows the way they always did this time of evening. Frogs, shut up. Beau stopped coiling the rope. Ryder killed the hose and listened. The silence was the kind that pressed on your ears. Storm coming? Sky's clear. Then they're just tired. Frogs get tired. Everything gets tired. Ryder stretched his back until something popped. I'm tired. You're tired. Amos looks like he's been tired since the Carter administration. Frogs don't get tired, Ryder. They're frogs. They do two things, make noise and eat bugs. That's it. That's the whole job. Maybe they're on break. Beau shook his head but let it go. There wasn't any point arguing with Ryder when he got like this. The man could talk himself into believing just about anything if it meant not having to think too hard about the alternative. From the main house, the screen door slapped shut. Juniper crossed the yard carrying a glass of sweet tea, the ice clinking soft against the sides, and she handed it to Amos without a word. She was 59 but looked older, worn down by decades of sun and water and work that never seemed to get easier no matter how many years you put into it. Her hair had gone gray early and she'd stopped dyeing it around the time their daughter moved to Atlanta and stopped calling. She had hands like Amos, cracked and tough as nails, permanently stained with the smell of bait and pond water. She stood there beside him for a moment, not saying anything, just looking out at the water where the last light was turning everything the color of rust. Something feels off. Juniper's voice was quiet, matter of fact, the same way she'd say the milk went bad or the truck needed gas. Amos drank half the tea in one long pull. He'd been saying that all week. Been feeling it all week. It's the harvest, Junie. End of season stress. Does funny things to your head. Juniper didn't argue. She never argued when it came to things like this. She just looked at the ponds, at the water sitting flat and dark as old coffee, and then she looked at the sky where the first stars were beginning to punch through the purple. I turned the mirrors. She crossed her arms, the ones facing the windows. Amos paused mid-sip. Junie. And I put salt by the doors. Don't step in it. Just let me have it. She took the empty glass from his hand before he could protest. Humor an old woman. Costs you nothing. She walked back to the house without waiting for an answer. Amos watched her go, shaking his head slow, but he didn't say anything else. 41 years of marriage had taught him which battles were worth fighting. This wasn't one of them. Juniper had always been like this, tuned into something he couldn't hear, worried about things that didn't have names. Her mama had been the same way, called it the knowing. Amos called it nerves, but he'd learned a long time ago to keep that opinion to himself. The dark came on fast the way it always does in the bayou. One minute the sky was purple and orange, and the next it was black as the bottom of a well. The ponds disappeared into shadow. The cypress trees turned into shapes without edges, and the silence that had started at sundown just kept getting thicker, pressing in from all sides like something with weight. Ryder and Beau ate supper in their trailer leftover jambalaya that Juniper had sent over the day before, reheated in a pan that probably should have been washed sometime in the last week. The airstream was cramped and smelled like engine grease and dirty laundry, but it was theirs. Ryder had won it in a poker game 3 years back from a guy in Beaumont who'd been too drunk to realize he was betting his home. Best hand Ryder ever played. Only good thing that had come out of his 20s besides his brother. 3 more weeks, Ryder said around a mouthful of rice. Maybe 4. Then we're done here. Then what? Then whatever. Something. Anything that ain't standing in swamp water 12 hours a day hoping my feet don't rot off. Beau pushed his food around the plate. He wasn't hungry. Hadn't been hungry all day, really. There was a feeling sitting in his chest that he couldn't quite name, tight and twisted, like waiting for bad news you knew was coming but couldn't do anything about. You ever notice how quiet it gets out here at night? Beau looked toward the window. It's the country, Beau. Quiet's the whole point. Nah, this is different. Usually you got the frogs going. Bugs, night birds, something. He looked toward the window, but all he could see was his own reflection staring back. Tonight there's nothing. Just nothing. Ryder shrugged and kept eating. Quiet's fine. Means nothing's trying to kill us. Since when has quiet ever meant that? Since I decided it does. Shut up and eat your jambalaya. Beau let it drop, but he didn't eat. He just sat there, listening to the nothing outside and trying to convince himself it didn't mean anything. They cleaned up the dishes, which meant throwing them in the sink and promising to deal with them tomorrow, and Ryder cracked open a beer and flopped down on the bench seat that doubled as his bed. He was halfway through some rant about a girl he'd met in town last week when the scraping started. It came from above them, slow, deliberate, like something dragging its fingers across the aluminum roof. Ryder stopped talking. Beau stood up from the tiny table, his chair scraping loud against the floor. The scraping moved from one end of the trailer to the other, methodical, patient, like it was measuring. "Raccoon?" Ryder said, but his voice had gone flat and he was already reaching for the shotgun they kept mounted above the door. "That ain't a raccoon. Big raccoon, possum, something." The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and thick. Beau could hear his own heartbeat knocking against his ribs. Then it started again, this time on the side of the trailer, down low near the wheels. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Ryder pumped the shotgun and killed the lights. The darkness inside was total, broken only by the thin blue glow of the microwave clock. They stood there in it, breathing shallow, listening. "Look out the window," Ryder whispered. "You look out the window. I got the gun. That's why you should look." Beau moved to the small window above the sink, keeping his body low, and peeled back the edge of the curtain just far enough to see outside. The yard was dark. The tree line was darker. He couldn't see much of anything except shadows on top of shadows, the shape of the equipment shed, the outline of Amos and Juniper's house with one light burning in the kitchen window. Then he saw them. 3 pale yellow orbs floating just beyond the trees, maybe 50 yards out. They hovered there in the dark, perfectly still, steady as stars that had been pulled too close to Earth. No flicker, no movement, just that soft, sick glow, the color of old teeth. "Ryder," Beau said. His voice didn't sound like his own. "What?" "Come look at this." Ryder moved to the window, and for a long moment neither of them said anything. They just stood there in the dark watching those lights hover in the tree line, not blinking, not moving, just watching right back. "Poachers," Ryder exhaled slow. "Spotlighters, probably jacking deer. Lights don't float like that. There's no beam, no source. They're just there. Then it's swamp gas, ball lightning, some science shit." "You really believe that?" Ryder didn't answer. He pumped the shotgun again even though there was already a shell chambered, just for the sound of it, just to feel like he was doing something. "I'm going out there." Ryder reached for the door handle. "That's a bad idea. I ain't sitting in here all night staring at weird lights in the woods. That's how people go crazy." Beau grabbed his arm. "Just wait. Let's see what they do." They waited. The lights didn't move, didn't come closer, didn't drift away. They just hung there in the dark like they had all the time in the world. Then Ryder opened the door. The night air hit them warm and wet, thick with the smell of the swamp. Ryder stepped out first, shotgun raised, sweeping the barrel across the yard. Beau followed with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark in a pale cone that didn't seem to reach far enough. "Hey!" Ryder shouted toward the tree line. "Hey! Who's out there?" His voice echoed across the water and died somewhere in the cypress. No answer came back. The lights didn't move. Ryder started walking toward them. "Ryder, don't. I'm just gonna get a better look. Stay here." He made it maybe 20 feet before the lights vanished, all three of them, at exactly the same instant. No fading, no drifting away. Just there 1 second and gone the next, like someone had flipped a switch. Ryder stopped. The hell? The silence pressed in around them. Beau swept the flashlight across the tree line, but there was nothing there. Just cypress and shadow and Spanish moss hanging still as death. "Let's go back inside." Beau was already turning toward the trailer. "Yeah." Ryder's voice had lost all its bravado. "Yeah, okay." They turned back toward the trailer, and that's when Beau saw the marsh buggy. It was parked where they'd left it that afternoon, down by the water's edge near the boat launch, but something was off about it. The silhouette was different, shorter, incomplete. He pointed the flashlight at it and felt his stomach drop. The outboard motor was gone. Not stolen, not unbolted and carried off, ripped clean away from the transom, the mounting bracket bent inward like soft metal, the bolts twisted and sheared. Whatever had taken it had pulled with enough force to warp the aluminum hull. "Holy shit," Ryder breathed. Beau knelt down and touched the torn metal. It was still warm, not hot, but warm, like something with body heat had been pressed against it recently. "We need to tell Amos." Beau straightened up from the torn metal. They ran to the main house and pounded on the door. No answer. Beau tried the handle unlocked and pushed inside. "Amos, Juniper." The kitchen light was on, but the house was quiet. They found Amos in the back bedroom, lying on top of the covers, fully clothed, shoes still on. His eyes were closed and his breathing was deep and slow, the kind of sleep that looks more like unconsciousness. "Amos." Beau shook his shoulder. Nothing. He shook harder. "Amos, wake up." The old man didn't stir, didn't mumble or twitch. He just kept breathing in that deep, mechanical rhythm, his face slack, his body heavy. "Something's wrong with him," Ryder's voice cracked. "He won't wake up." "I can see that." "Well, what do we do?" A voice came from the doorway behind them. "He won't wake until morning." They spun around. Juniper stood there in her nightgown, arms crossed, face calm in a way that didn't match anything that was happening. She looked at her husband on the bed, then at the two young men standing over him, and her expression didn't change. "This happened before." She didn't blink. "When I was a girl, my daddy slept for 3 days straight. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't wake for anything. Mama said something had borrowed him for a while." "Borrowed him?" Ryder's voice cracked. "What does that mean?" Juniper didn't answer the question. She walked to the window and looked out at the dark. "You saw the lights. It wasn't a question." "Yeah, out by the trees. 3 of them. They'll be back." She pulled the curtain shut. "Go to your trailer. Lock the door. Don't open it until sunup, no matter what you hear." "What are they?" Beau asked. Juniper turned to look at him, and for just a second something moved behind her eyes, something old and tired and deeply afraid. Something that's been out there longer than we've been here. Her eyes moved to the window. Something that doesn't like us much. Now go. And don't look back at the tree line when you walk. They didn't sleep that night. They sat in the trailer with the lights off and the shotgun across Ryder's lap, listening to the nothing outside and waiting for something to happen. A few times Beau thought he heard movement, soft footsteps in the grass. A gentle thump against the trailer wall, but every time he looked out the window, there was nothing there. The lights didn't come back. When the sun finally broke over the tree line, they went outside to assess the damage. It was worse than they'd expected. The marsh buggy wasn't just missing its motor anymore. It had been split clean in half, the hull torn open like wet cardboard, the seats scattered across the yard. The fuel tank had been punctured and emptied, leaving a dark stain in the grass that smelled sharp and chemical. Near the equipment shed, 6 chickens lay dead on the ground. Their throats had been cut with something sharp, clean cuts, surgical almost, and their bodies had been washed and hung neatly from the rafters by their feet. No blood anywhere, not on the ground, not on the feathers, not on the twine that held them up. They'd been bled somewhere else and brought back to be displayed. And on the windshield of the side-by-side, written in grease and mud and something darker, were 2 words. "We're waiting." Amos stood in the yard looking at the damage, his face gray, his eyes red-rimmed from sleep that hadn't refreshed him. He didn't remember anything from the night before. Didn't remember going to bed. Didn't remember Beau and Ryder trying to wake him. Didn't remember anything after sitting down to supper with Juniper. "Kids." Amos's voice came out hollow. "Has to be kids. Bored local kids playing pranks. Kids didn't rip that motor off." Ryder pointed at the twisted metal. "Kids didn't split a fiberglass hull in half. Then it was, I don't know, vandals, tweakers. There's a meth problem in this parish. Everybody knows it." "Amos," Juniper's voice was quiet but firm, "you know that's not what this is." "I don't know anything, Junie. I don't know a damn thing right now." He walked away toward the pond, toward the water, toward the only thing that had ever made sense to him. "He'll come around." Juniper watched him go, speaking more to herself than to anyone else. "He always does. Just takes him longer." The sheriff showed up around noon, a heavy man named Thibodeau who smelled like cigarettes and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He took pictures of the damage with his phone, wrote a few notes in a pad he kept in his shirt pocket, and asked the same questions 3 different ways without really listening to the answers. "Kids," Thibodeau tucked his thumbs in his belt. "We've had some trouble with the Guidry boys lately. Probably them." "Kids didn't do this." Beau stepped toward him. "You'd be surprised what bored teenagers can do with enough time and enough anger." Thibodeau tucked his notepad away. "I'll have a deputy swing by tonight. Keep an eye on things." "You're not going to investigate?" "Investigate what? Property damage? I'll file a report. Y'all can claim it on insurance." He left without looking back at the tree line. Juniper waited until his car was out of sight, then walked to the side-by-side and started scraping the words off the windshield with a hunting knife. She didn't say anything while she worked. Didn't look at anyone. Just scraped until the glass was clean and the message was nothing but smears on the ground. That night, the lights came back. They appeared just after sunset, the same pale yellow as before, hovering at the edge of the tree line. But this time there were more of them. 5, maybe 6. It was hard to tell because they kept drifting apart and coming back together, like they were communicating in a language that had nothing to do with sound. And this time they were closer. They drifted along the edge of the ponds, slow and patient, like they were counting something, taking inventory. The glow from each orb cast no shadows, threw no reflection on the water. They moved without sound, without wind, without any sign that they were connected to anything physical at all. Beau watched from the kitchen window of the main house, where they'd all gathered after deciding the trailer wasn't safe anymore. Ryder stood beside him, the shotgun in his hands, his knuckles white on the stock. Amos sat at the table with his head in his hands, still trying to convince himself there was a rational explanation. Juniper stood by the stove, not looking outside, her lips moving in words too quiet to hear. "What are they doing?" Beau asked. "Watching," Juniper said without turning around. "Learning." "Learning what?" "How we move." Where we go? What scares us? She finally turned to face the window, her expression flat and tired. They've been out there a long time. Longer than the town. Longer than the farms. We're not the first ones they've done this to. We won't be the last. Ryder's hands were shaking. I'm going out there. No. Juniper's voice was sharp. You stay inside. You stay away from the windows. And you don't. I'm not going to sit here and let them. Ryder. Beau grabbed his brother's arm. Listen to her. Listen to her. She's talking crazy, Beau. Lights in the woods that have been here longer than the town. That's not real. That's not how anything works. Then what is it? What's your explanation? Ryder didn't have one. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words that wouldn't come, and after a moment he just shook his head and turned away from the window. Screw this. Ryder was already moving toward the door. Screw all of this. He was out the door before anyone could stop him. Ryder! Beau lunged for the doorway, but Juniper caught his arm with a grip stronger than he'd expected from a woman her age. Don't. Juniper's grip tightened on his arm. Don't go after him. He's my brother. And if you go out there, you'll both die. At least this way, one of you has a chance. Outside, they could hear Ryder's boots pounding across the yard, heading toward the tree line. He was shouting something, curses, challenges, the kind of bravado that sounds hollow even when you're the one saying it. The lights began to move. They drifted toward him, slow at first, then faster. The gaps between them closed until they formed a loose ring, circling, cutting off his path to the trees and his path back to the house. Ryder stopped running. Even from the window, Beau could see his brother's posture change, the bravado draining out of him, replaced by something smaller and more animal. Ryder, come back, Beau screamed to the glass. Run, just run. Ryder tried. He turned and sprinted toward the house, legs pumping, arms swinging. He made it maybe 15 feet before one of the lights shot toward him, not floating anymore, not drifting, but moving with purpose, with speed, covering the distance between them in less than a heartbeat. It hit him and he went down. The light didn't make a sound. Ryder did. He screamed a raw, animal sound that Beau had never heard come out of his brother before, and then he was being dragged. Not toward the trees, but away from them, out toward the ponds, his fingers clawing at the grass, leaving furrows in the mud. Beau broke free of Juniper's grip and ran for the door. Beau, no. He didn't listen. He couldn't. That was his brother out there, his only family left, and he wasn't going to stand at a window and watch him die. He burst outside into the warm, wet air and saw Ryder being pulled toward the water. The light that had him was hovering directly above his body now, and in its glow, Beau could see something else, something attached to Ryder, something with long, thin arms and fingers that bent in too many places. It was dragging him by the ankle, moving backward toward the pond, and its body was twisted in ways that Beau's brain refused to fully process. Too tall, too narrow. Skin that looked like it had been stretched over a frame that wasn't meant to hold it. Let him go. Beau raised the pistol he didn't remember grabbing and fired 3 times. The shots cracked across the water and the thing flinched. Actually flinched. It released Ryder's ankle and turned toward Beau, and for one terrible moment he saw its face, or the place where a face should have been. Smooth and featureless, except for 2 deep hollows where eyes might have gone, and a mouth that was too wide, too thin, curling at the edges like it was smiling at a joke only it understood. Then the light above it flared bright enough to bleach the world white, and when Beau could see again, the thing was gone. He ran to Ryder. His brother was still breathing, still conscious, his eyes wide and wet and fixed on the sky above them. It was cold, Ryder whispered. His voice sounded hollow, broken. Its hands were so cold. Beau, can you walk? We need to get inside. There's more of them. I saw in the water there's more." "I know. Come on, get up." He hauled Ryder to his feet and half carried him back to the house. Juniper was holding the door open, her face pale in the yellow porch light, and the moment they were inside, she slammed it shut and threw the deadbolt home. Salt. Juniper was already moving. "Help me with the salt." They poured lines of salt across every threshold, every windowsill, every crack and seam where something might try to get through. Juniper worked fast and methodical, her hands steady even as the sound started outside, scratching on the walls, thumping on the roof, something heavy dragging itself across the porch boards. "They can't get past it." She finished a windowsill. Salt disrupts them. It's not perfect, but it's something. "What are they?" Beau demanded. "What the hell are those things?" Juniper finished the last windowsill and set down the canister. Her hands were shaking now, the steadiness gone. "Where I grew up, we called them the hungry ones." Juniper set down the canister. "Other places got other names. Swamp walkers, will-o-wisps, rougarou. It's all the same thing dressed up different, something old, something that was here before the French came, before the Spanish, before anyone thought to put a name to this place. They come out when they're ready to feed, and they don't stop until they've taken what they want." "What do they want?" Juniper looked at him with eyes that had seen too much over too many years. "Us." The word hung there. Gone, off the land, one way or another. The siege lasted until dawn. They threw things at the house, dead animals mostly, carcasses that hit the walls with wet, heavy thumps, possums, nutria, a full-grown deer that crashed through the kitchen window and landed on the table in a spray of glass and blood and splintered wood. Its body had been opened up and emptied out, the organs removed with surgical precision, the cavity packed with mud and Spanish moss like some kind of obscene taxidermy. Hands came through the broken window, long and thin and bone-white, with too many joints in the fingers. They grabbed at the curtains, at the salt line, at anything within reach. Juniper beat them back with a cast-iron skillet while Amos finally woke up from whatever daze he'd been in and started boarding up the frame with pieces torn from the dining room table. The scratching never stopped. It circled the house in waves, moving from wall to wall, room to room, testing for weaknesses. Sometimes it would go quiet for a few minutes, long enough for hope to start creeping in, and then it would start again louder than before. They never fully came inside. Juniper said it was the salt, said they couldn't cross it, couldn't stand the touch of it, but Beau wasn't sure that was the whole truth. He watched those pale arms reaching through the window, watched how they stopped just short of the salt line like there was an invisible wall there. And he got the feeling it wasn't that they couldn't cross, it was that they were choosing not to. Not yet, not while there was still more to learn about the things trapped inside. When the sun finally came up, the sound stopped. The arms withdrew. The lights that had been hovering over the ponds all night drifted back toward the trees and vanished one by one, winking out like candles being snuffed. In the daylight, they counted the damage. The kitchen window was gone entirely. The siding on the east side of the house had been clawed down to bare wood in places, deep gouges that looked like something had been trying to peel the wall apart. Dead animals littered the yard like some kind of obscene offering, dozens of them, all cleaned and emptied and arranged in neat rows facing the house. Ryder sat on the porch with a blanket around his shoulders, staring at nothing. He hadn't spoken since they'd gotten him inside. The bruises on his ankle where the thing had grabbed him had turned black overnight, the skin mottled and unnatural, like frostbite on a body that hadn't been anywhere near cold. The sheriff came back around noon. Thibodeau walked through the yard with his hands in his pockets, looking at the dead animals, at the claw marks on the siding, at Ryder sitting shell-shocked on the porch. His face stayed carefully blank the whole time, the expression of a man who'd already decided what he was going to believe and wasn't interested in any evidence to the contrary. Wild dogs. Thibodeau kept his face carefully blank. Pack of feral dogs came through. It happens sometimes out here. Wild dogs didn't do this, Beau said. He was too tired for anger. It came out flat and hollow. Wild dogs don't hang chickens by their feet. They don't write messages on windshields. They don't... Son, Thibodeau held up a hand like he was directing traffic. I know you've had a rough night. I know things look bad right now. But I've been working this parish for 23 years, and I've seen what happens when people start believing in things that ain't there. It never ends well for anybody. I saw them. We all saw them. You saw lights in the swamp. You saw shadows moving around. You got scared and your brain filled in the details the way brains do. He turned to head back to his car. I'll file a report. Y'all should think about getting out of here for a few days. Let things settle down. What about Ryder? Beau called after him. He was attacked. Something grabbed him and dragged him halfway across the yard. Thibodeau didn't turn around. I'll make a note of it. He drove away without another word, leaving a cloud of dust that hung in the still air long after his car had disappeared. Juniper watched him go, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. He knows. Juniper kept her voice low. He's known for years. Half this parish knows. They just don't talk about it because talking about it makes it real, and real is something they can't do anything about. Then why won't they help? Because there's no helping. Not the way you're thinking. She put a hand on his shoulder, and for a moment she looked every one of her 59 years and then some. They come every generation or so. They take what they take. Then they move on to somewhere else. The only thing folks around here have figured out is that fighting back makes it worse. So they don't fight. They wait it out, and they pray they're not the ones who get taken. That's it? Beau's voice cracked. That's the plan? Just wait and hope? Juniper's jaw tightened. Something hard moved behind her eyes. That's been the plan for 100 years, maybe longer. She looked out at the tree line, at the cypress standing dark and silent in the morning light. But I'm tired of waiting, and I think maybe it's time somebody tried something different. That night, they didn't wait for the lights to come to them. Amos spent the afternoon rigging traps. He used everything he had: crawfish nets rewoven with copper wire, old fence posts sharpened to points, a generator that had been sitting in the shed for years waiting for a purpose. He wasn't sure exactly what he was building. It wasn't like there was a manual for catching things that shouldn't exist. But he'd been trapping things in these waters for 40 years, and if there was one thing he understood down to his bones, it was how to make something that didn't want to be caught get caught anyway. The nets won't hold them, Juniper said, watching him work. They're not physical. Not all the way. Then we make them physical. Amos tightened a connection on the generator, his hands moving with the confidence of a man who'd finally found something he could do. You said salt disrupts them. Electricity might do something too. Copper conducts. The nets are copper wire now. We run current through them. Maybe we slow them down long enough to do some real damage. Maybe. Maybe's all we got, Junie. They set the traps at the pond's edge, right where the lights had been hovering the night before. The nets were strung between fence posts driven deep into the mud, loose enough to give when something hit them but tight enough to tangle anything that tried to push through. The generator sat 20 feet back, cables running to the copper mesh, ready to send a few hundred volts into whatever got caught. It wasn't much, but it was more than waiting. Beau found Ryder still sitting on the porch as the sun started going down. His brother hadn't moved all day, hadn't eaten, hadn't done much of anything except stare at the tree line with hollow eyes that didn't seem to see what was in front of them. The bruises on his ankle had spread up his calf overnight, black and purple and sick-looking, the skin tight and shiny like it was holding something in that wanted to get out. Hey, Beau sat down beside him on the worn wooden boards. "How you feeling?" Ryder didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, like he hadn't used it in days instead of hours. "I saw where they come from." Ryder stared at the tree line. "When it was dragging me, I saw—" "What do you mean?" "There's a place out in the deep water where the swamp gets thick, where the trees grow out of the water in these big twisted shapes like hands reaching up." Ryder's own hands were trembling in his lap, shaking so bad he had to press them against his thighs to keep them still. "They come up from under. There's holes in the water, in the ground underneath, and they come up out of them like they're being born. Hundreds of them, Beau. Maybe thousands. All those lights, all those things with the long arms and the faces that aren't faces." Beau felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Ryder, they're not trying to scare us off. That's not what this is." Ryder finally turned to look at him, and his eyes were wet and red and filled with something that might have been terror or might have been the kind of acceptance that comes when you've already given up. "They're testing. Figuring out how we work, how we break. We're not the first ones they've done this to. I saw. In that place, I saw bones. Piles of them. Old ones. New ones. They've been doing this forever, Beau. Since before there were people here to do it to. We're going to stop them." Ryder laughed. It was a broken sound, sharp and hollow. Nothing like the laugh Beau had grown up hearing. "No, we're not. You can't stop something like that. You can't even hurt something like that. All you can do is—" He stopped mid-sentence. His head turned toward the tree line, slow and mechanical, like something was pulling it. The lights were coming. More than before. A dozen of them at least, maybe more, drifting out of the trees in a loose formation that spread wider as it approached. They moved with purpose now. Not the lazy floating of the previous nights, but something directed, coordinated, like a hunting party that had finally located its prey. They spread out as they got closer, forming a wide arc that curved around the property like a noose slowly tightening. "Get inside." Beau grabbed his brother's shoulder. Ryder didn't move. He just sat there watching the lights come closer, his face empty, his hands finally still in his lap. "Ryder, get inside now. It doesn't matter." His voice was calm, resigned, the voice of a man who'd already made his peace with something terrible. They already know everything they need to know. They've been watching us, learning us. Tonight they finish what they started. Beau grabbed his brother's arm and hauled him to his feet. "I'm not letting you give up. Not like this. Now come on." They made it to the door just as the first light reached the edge of the yard. Inside, Amos was at the window with his rifle, the barrel resting on the sill, his eye pressed to the scope. Juniper stood by the generator switch they'd run inside, her hand on the lever, waiting. The salt lines were fresh and thick, white stripes across every threshold like the house had been marked for something. "They're here," Beau said, pushing Ryder toward a chair. "More than last night. A lot more. I see them." Amos didn't look away from the window. "They're going for the traps, circling them." The lights had found the nets. They drifted around the copper mesh in slow loops, probing, testing, like predators examining something they'd never encountered before. One of them dipped low, brushing against the wire, and immediately pulled back. "They don't like it." Juniper leaned closer to the glass. "The copper, it's doing something to them. Wait until more of them are close." Amos didn't look away from the scope. Then hit the power. They waited. The lights continued to circle, more of them joining the group, clustering around the nets like moths drawn to a flame they knew better than to touch. They seemed curious despite their apparent discomfort, drawn to the copper even as it pushed them away. "Now," Amos pulled back from the window. Juniper threw the switch. The generator roared to life, coughing once before settling into a steady throb. Current surged through the copper nets, and the lights, the ones closest to the mesh, screamed. It wasn't a sound that should have been possible. It was too high, too sharp, too alien, like metal scraping against metal somewhere deep inside your skull. The lights flared bright, then brighter, then so bright that Beau had to shield his eyes and turn away. When he could see again, two of them were caught in the nets, tangled, struggling, and in the glow of the electricity arcing through the copper, he could see what was inside them. Shapes, bodies, things that were almost human but stretched and distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror that had been left in the sun too long. Their skin was pale and slick, their limbs too long by half, their joints bending backward as they fought against the mesh. They had faces of a sort. Smooth planes with deep hollows where eyes might have gone and mouths that split open too wide, showing rows of teeth that looked like they'd been borrowed from a dozen different animals and jammed into a single jaw without any concern for how they'd fit. Holy God, Amos breathed. One of them got free. It ripped through the net with a sound like tearing canvas and lunged toward the house, moving faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Juniper was ready. She had the shotgun up and firing before the thing made it 10 feet, and its shoulder exploded in a spray of something dark that wasn't quite blood. It staggered, actually staggered, looked down at the wound like it couldn't understand what had happened, and then it screamed again and fled back toward the trees, leaving a trail of that dark liquid behind it, steaming where it hit the ground. "They can bleed," Juniper said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking on the stock of the gun. I knew it. I always knew they could bleed. But the second one was still caught, still struggling in the copper mesh, its body flickering in and out of visibility like a bad signal on an old television. And the others, the ones that hadn't gotten close enough to get tangled, were pulling back, regrouping at the tree line, learning, adapting, figuring out what had gone wrong and how to avoid it next time. "Beau." Amos's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Fear, exhaustion, the resignation of a man who'd seen enough to know how this was going to end. "I need you to do something for me." "What?" "I need you to draw them in." "Draw them? What do you mean?" "The traps work. The copper works. But they won't come close enough anymore unless they've got something to come for." Amos finally turned away from the window. His face was gray in the dim light, his eyes red-rimmed and tired. He looked like a man who'd already made peace with something terrible. "I need you to go out there and bring them to us." "Amos, that's suicide." "I ain't asking you to die, son. I'm asking you to run, fast as you can, toward the traps. Get them to chase you, then get out of the way and let the nets do their work." Beau looked at Ryder, still slumped in the chair where he'd been put, staring at nothing with empty eyes. He looked at Juniper, reloading the shotgun with hands that weren't quite steady anymore. He looked at the window, at the light still hovering at the tree line, patient and watchful and hungry. "Okay," the word came out before Beau could stop it. He was out the door before he could think about it long enough to change his mind. The night air hit him like a wet blanket, warm, thick, heavy, with the smell of ozone and copper and something else underneath. Something sweet and rotten that reminded him of the way roadkill smells after it's been sitting in the sun. The lights were maybe 60 yards away, clustered near the cypress in a loose formation, their pale glow reflecting off the still water of the ponds. "Hey," Beau shouted. His voice cracked, but he kept going. "Over here. You want something to chase? Come on." They turned toward him, all of them at once, like a single organism with a dozen heads. It was like watching a school of fish pivot in perfect unison, every point of light swinging around to focus on the single stupid human standing in the middle of the yard with nothing but a flashlight and a prayer. He ran, not toward the house, not toward the trailer, toward the traps, toward the net still strung between the fence posts, the generator still humming, the copper mesh still sparking with current and the dark fluids of the thing that had gotten away. The lights followed. He could hear them behind him, that strange electric buzz they made when they moved fast, could feel the air pressure change as they got closer, pushing against his back, cold despite the warm night. His boots slammed into the mud, slipping, catching, his lungs burning, his legs screaming at him to stop. He didn't stop. The nets were right there. 15 feet, 10 feet, 5. He dove. He went through the gap between two posts, rolling in the mud, coming up on the other side with his hands scraped raw and his heart trying to punch its way out of his chest. The first of the lights hit the mesh maybe half a second after he cleared it. The electricity surged. The thing inside the light shrieked and flailed and got tangled in the copper wire. Then the second one hit, and the third. Beau scrambled backward through the mud as more of them piled into the trap, drawn by the struggling of the ones already caught, too focused on their prey to notice the danger until it was too late. The generator whined, the current fluctuated, sparks shooting from the connections, and for one terrible moment he thought the whole thing was going to overload and fail, and leave him lying in the mud with a dozen of those things between him and the house. But it held. 5 of them were caught now. 6, 7. They screamed and thrashed and tore at the copper, their bodies flickering in and out of visibility like they were being pulled between 2 different versions of reality. In the strobing light, Beau could see glimpses of what they really looked like: the stretched skin, the backwards joints, the mouths that never stopped moving even when nothing was coming out. Then Juniper was there. She walked toward the nets like she was taking a stroll on a Sunday afternoon, pumping the shotgun with hands that had finally stopped shaking. She stopped maybe 6 feet from the tangled mass of light and flesh and wrongness, raised the barrel, and started firing. The first shot took one of them in what might have been its head. The skull, if that's what it was, came apart in a spray of dark fluid and something that looked like wet sand. The second shot caught another one in the chest, punching a hole clean through its torso. The third and fourth and fifth shots just kept coming, methodical and precise, and with each one, another piece of another creature came apart. They screamed. God, they screamed. That sound, that metal-on-metal shriek that went straight through your skull and rattled around inside your brain, it filled the night like a physical thing, like pressure, like pain given a voice. And then they stopped. The ones in the nets had stopped moving, stopped screaming, stopped flickering. They just hung there in the copper mesh, dark and still and finally, blessedly, dead. The lights that hadn't been caught, maybe 4 or 5 of them, now fled. They shot up into the sky like reverse lightning, fast and bright, and disappeared over the tree line into the dark. The silence that followed was the most beautiful thing Beau had ever heard. Juniper stood there for a long moment, the shotgun smoking in her hands, looking at what she'd done. Then she turned to Beau, and there was something in her face he'd never seen before. Not satisfaction exactly, not triumph, something harder, something older. "That's 7. Juniper lowered the shotgun. "That's 7 of them that won't be coming back." In the sudden quiet, Beau became aware of 2 things at almost the same instant. 1. Juniper was bleeding. The sleeve of her shirt was dark and wet, torn at the shoulder where something had gotten through when he wasn't looking. She didn't seem to notice or care. 2. Ryder was gone. He wasn't on the porch, wasn't visible through the kitchen window. The front door of the house was hanging open, swinging slowly in the breeze that had finally started to blow in from the water. "Ryder!" Beau ran for the house, his boots slipping in the mud, his heart starting to pound again. "Ryder!" He found his brother at the pond's edge. Ryder was standing knee-deep in the black water, facing the tree line, perfectly still. The last of the lights hovered just above the cypress, watching, waiting, like it knew something was about to happen and didn't want to miss it. "Ryder, What are you doing? Get out of the water." Finishing it. Ryder's voice was calm. Too calm. The voice of a man who'd already made a decision and was just waiting for his body to catch up. "They're never going to stop, Beau. Not until they get what they came for. Not until they've taken everything. Get out of the water. Come back to the house. We can figure this out. We can—" No. Ryder turned to look at him, and his face was peaceful in a way that Beau had never seen on his brother before. Not happy exactly, just quiet, settled. Like a man who'd finally put down something heavy he'd been carrying for too long. "I saw what they do, Beau. I saw where they take people. I'm not going to let that happen to you. To any of you. Ryder, please. Tell Mama I'm sorry I didn't come home for Christmas last year. Tell her I meant to. I kept meaning to." His voice cracked just slightly. "Tell her I love her. And tell her Beau's gonna be okay. He's always been the tough one anyway." He walked deeper into the water. "Ryder, stop. Ryder." The light above the trees descended. It came down slow and bright, and in its glow Beau could see things moving beneath the surface of the pond, pale shapes rising from the deep, dozens of them, reaching up with those long, twisted arms and too many fingers. He ran for the water. He didn't think about it, didn't weigh the odds, didn't do any of the calculations he usually did. He just ran. But he wasn't fast enough. The light reached Ryder first. It touched him, just touched him, barely a brush of contact, and he went rigid. His back arched, his arms flew out to his sides, his mouth opened in a scream that started loud and then just stopped, cut off like someone had thrown a switch. The things beneath the surface surged up around him, pale arms and grasping hands, pulling at his clothes, his legs, his waist. They didn't drag him down all at once. They pulled him apart first. Beau was close enough to see it happen, close enough to see his brother's body come apart at the joints, shoulders separating, hips dislocating, spine bending in directions it was never meant to go. Close enough to hear the sounds, the wet tearing, the muffled snapping of tendons and ligaments giving way, the soft, almost gentle splash as pieces of what had been Ryder Reed sank beneath the black water one by one. Close enough to see his brother's face still peaceful, still calm, still wearing that quiet expression of a man who'd made his peace as it slipped below the surface and didn't come back up. The light shot up into the sky, the water went still, the things beneath the surface sank back down into whatever hell they'd crawled out of, and Ryder was gone. Dawn came slow and gray and mean. Beau sat on the porch in the same spot where Ryder had sat the day before, staring at the pond, waiting for something that was never going to surface. The water was still now, undisturbed, flat as glass and dark as oil. It showed no sign of what had happened, what it had taken, what it had swallowed whole and pulled down into itself. Inside, Juniper was wrapping her shoulder with strips torn from a bedsheet, not making a sound even though the cuts had to hurt like hell. Amos had finally collapsed into bed around 4 in the morning, exhausted beyond words, the adrenaline of the night having drained everything he had left. The dead things in the nets had started dissolving with the first light of dawn, their bodies coming apart into that dark fluid and wet sand until there was nothing left but stains on the copper and a smell like burnt hair and ozone. They'd won, if you could call it winning. The harvest would survive, barely. They'd lost half the equipment, a good chunk of the house, and more peace of mind than any of them would ever get back. But the crawfish were still in the ponds and the season wasn't over yet. They could still sell, still pay off the loans, still keep the land for another year. Amos would say that was what mattered, the land, the legacy, the thing worth fighting for. Beau wasn't sure he believed that anymore. 3 weeks later, Juniper stood outside at night. The shoulder had mostly healed. It left a scar that ran from her collarbone to the top of her arm, raised and pink against her dark skin. She didn't mind. Scars meant you survived. Scars meant you were still here to complain about how much they itched when the weather changed. The harvest was over. They'd made enough to cover the loans and the repairs, barely, with a little left over to start rebuilding what had been destroyed. Beau had stayed to help finish the season, but he was leaving in the morning, heading east, he said, maybe north. Somewhere with more people and less water and fewer things that came up from the deep places when the frogs went quiet. She didn't blame him. There was nothing here for him now except ghosts and memories and a pond that had swallowed his brother whole. She looked out at the tree line, at the darkness where the cypress grew thick and the Spanish moss hung still and heavy. No lights tonight. There hadn't been any since that last night. Since they'd killed those things in the copper nets, since Ryder had walked into the water and not come back. Maybe they'd learned something. Maybe they'd decided this particular piece of land wasn't worth the cost of taking it. Or maybe they were just patient, waiting, the way they'd been waiting for 100 years before the Fletchers ever put down roots here. But far off, past the property line, past the levees and the access roads, she could see them. Pale yellow orbs hovering over the Thibodeau place a few miles south, drifting slow and patient over the Guidry property to the east, circling the old Whitfield land where nobody had lived for years, but the for sale signs kept going up anyway. They were moving on. They'd found what they were looking for here or learned that it wasn't worth fighting for. Either way, they were done with the Fletcher property. Done with this particular piece of swamp that had been held and worked and bled over for 4 generations. They'd taken their price and moved on to easier prey. But they weren't done, not by a long shot. Juniper watched the distant lights drift and hover over those other farms, and she thought about the people who lived there, the families who didn't know what was coming, who would go to bed tonight thinking they were safe, thinking the worst things they had to worry about were mortgages and harvests, and whether their kids would call home for the holidays. She could warn them, drive over tomorrow, knock on doors, tell them what she knew. They wouldn't believe her. They'd look at her the way the sheriff had looked at Amos, with that careful blank expression that meant they'd already decided what was real and what wasn't. They'd nod and smile politely and wait for the crazy old woman to leave so they could get back to their lives. And then the lights would come for them too. That was the way it had always been. That was the way it would always be. You couldn't save people from things they refused to see. You could only survive yourself and hope that was enough. Juniper stood there in the dark for a long time, watching the distant lights hover over the neighboring farms. Then she went inside, locked the door, and poured a fresh line of salt across the threshold, just in case. Folklore note: the lights over Bayou Blue have been documented in Terrebonne parish records going back to 1863, though the oral traditions of the Homa and Chitimacha people suggest they've been here much longer than that. The earliest written reports describe them as marsh fires or swamp gas, but the details never quite match any natural phenomenon science has been able to explain. They appear at night, usually in groups of 3 or more, and they move with apparent purpose, circling, approaching, retreating like predators testing the boundaries of new territory. The disappearance rate in Terrebonne Parish runs roughly 3 times the state average for rural areas of comparable size. The official explanations are always the same: drowning, exposure, getting lost in the bayou after dark. The swamp is dangerous, everyone knows that. People make mistakes, accidents happen. But there are patterns in the data, if you know what to look for. Clusters of disappearances that line up with light sightings. Bodies that are never recovered despite extensive searches. Witnesses who describe seeing things in the deep water that they can't quite put into words, tall shapes, twisted shapes, things that move against the current and don't make any sound. The old Homa stories speak of something that came before the flood, something that slept beneath the black water for centuries and wakes hungry when the world forgets to be afraid. The Cajun tales describe spirits of the drowned, jealous of the living, luring the unwary into deep places where the light never reaches and the water never lets go. Nobody talks about it much anymore, not publicly, not where outsiders might hear, but every family that's been in the parish for more than a generation knows someone who's seen the lights. Someone who's lost a family member under circumstances that never quite added up. Someone who packed up and moved away in the middle of the night and never said why. The lights over Bayou Blue are still there, if you know when and where to look. They learned what we would fight for, and they learned who to wait for next. Well, boys and ghouls, that wraps up another terrorific tale from the vault. That didn't go as planned for old Ryder, did it? Oh, poor guy. Thought he could save everybody by walking into the water and making friends with the things underneath. Thought maybe if he gave them what they wanted, they'd leave the others alone. And you know what? Maybe he was right. Maybe his sacrifice meant something. Or maybe the hungry ones just took what they could get and moved on to easier pickings. Either way, Ryder Reed ain't coming home for Christmas this year. Or any year. Just how we love it. And Beau? Poor Beau gets to carry that around forever. Gets to remember watching his brother come apart at the seams like a cheap suit in a wood chipper. Gets to wake up every night wondering if, maybe, just maybe, he could have gotten there half a second faster. That's the real horror, isn't it? Not the dying, the surviving. If this story left you checking the water for pale shapes that shouldn't be there, hit that subscribe button. New creature features drop every single night at 8 p.m. Central, and trust me, tomorrow's got teeth. Leave a like if you're never trusting quiet frogs again, and drop a comment where you're listening from tonight. You got any local legends about lights in the water? Things that come up from the deep places? I'm always hungry for the next nightmare. Remember, the bayou doesn't care about your harvest, doesn't care about your legacy, doesn't care about the land you've been fighting to keep for 4 generations. It just waits, patient, hungry. And when the frogs go quiet, well, that's when you know something's coming up to feed. Until next time, kiddies, keep your salt lines fresh and your copper wire charged. This has been your late night creature feature. I'm Mr. Wendigo, and the water remembers everything you try to forget.